This is episode 559 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am joined by two guests today. First is Brian Knight. He is director of the program on financial regulation, and he is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And then we have Rees Empey. He is director of state government affairs at the Libertas Institute based in Utah, which is a state-based think tank up in the Beehive State. So, gentlemen, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Rees and I, you and I have talked and met many times in person, and we'll get to you in just a second, Rees. But Brian, with the Mercatus Center, talk a little bit about the Mercatus Center and what it really is. It's obviously affiliated with George Mason University, which my free market followers may have their ears perk up because of what George Mason's economics department stands for, et cetera. But briefly describe Mercatus, if you would, Brian.
Sure. We're a university-based research center. As you say, we are housed at the George Mason University in Northern Virginia. My work, I'm part of the applied research team, which has a team of scholars that look at various issues. My focus is on financial regulation, and our mission is to, as we say, bridge the gap between academic ideas and real-world problems.
Excellent. And Rees, if people nationwide know of the Libertas, they may know of the Tuttle Twins kids book series and the expanding empire that is the Tuttle Twins. But tell us briefly about the Libertas Institute.
Yeah, I think the best way to describe it is we're a sister organization to your organization, Rio Grande Foundation. We're based in Lehi, Utah, about 45 minutes south of Salt Lake City. And in the state of Utah, we work on everything from local government to education reform to tech and innovation. And my job there is to try and bring some of our good ideas to other states while retrieving good ideas from those other states to bring back to Utah. As you mentioned, we also publish the Tuttle Twins books, which try and teach young folks about free market principles.
Excellent. Today, we are going to be talking about a concept that chances are approximately 0% of our listeners are familiar with, but it may come up. It came up in the last session, the 60-day session in New Mexico, at least as a bill. It was introduced by a Democrat, so it has legs in the sense that, we have a Democrat-dominated legislature, but it is a regulatory sandbox. And both of you gentlemen have played different roles in the development and implementation of the sandbox concept. So, Brian, since you're more on the academic and research side, why don't you give us, kind of your role in the sandbox world and what really a sandbox is all about when it comes to regulation, not kids playing with trucks and toys.
Okay, so you're asking about the less fun sandbox. Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first. The regulatory sandbox is a sort of regulatory construct or environment that allows for market participants to experiment in scenarios where the regulations might otherwise prohibit or impede them doing something. The sort of paradigmatic example would be someone who wants to offer a product or service that generally requires a license to do so. But if you think you have a new way to do something, but you're not entirely certain it works, and to try it, you have to go through the time-consuming and expensive process of obtaining a license and all of that, you may not try. Whereas if you can enter a regulatory sandbox and, subject to the oversight of the relevant regulator and subject to certain conditions, and including the ability to protect consumers if something goes wrong, if you can experiment, then if it works, great. You can then go off, get the full license, move on. If it doesn't work, you haven't gone through all that time and expense to try, or have not given it a try because the barriers to entry were too high. We see regulatory sandboxes, at least in the current configuration, broadly defined, got their start in the UK with the Financial Conduct Authority in, I believe, 2016. And then in a couple of years, several jurisdictions globally had begun experimenting with them, and Arizona was the first U.S. state to launch a sandbox for financial technology. Utah followed suit, and from there, thanks in no small part to the fine folks at Libertas, it has been sort of expanding out. And I forget the exact count of states that have sandboxes, but I want to say it's 12 or 13, with quite a few more considering these sandboxes. And they start off in financial regulation, which makes sense because financial services are both heavily and preemptively regulated, right? You generally need to go get the regulator's permission to offer the service in the first place, and then there's significant regulation on how it's done. But they've expanded out, and now multiple states, including Utah and Arizona, have what are called universal sandboxes, where they're not industry specific and they're not regulator specific, but rather there's sort of a single point of entry that can then, where a government agency responsible for economic development generally can then work with the relevant regulator. An application comes in, they work with the relevant regulator to see if the application is a good fit and what sort of regulatory relief they might grant.
Okay, before, well, for either of you, and I want to ask Rees some more questions, but do you have a specific example or examples of businesses that have used this regulatory concept, the sandbox, in what kind of regulation were they able to overcome in whatever state they did that? Any specifics?
I can give an example from Utah's, and I want to
Great.
note that there are 14 states with sandboxes now. 3 of them have universal, Kentucky being that third one. And also another interesting fact is there are about 14 states that have not yet discussed or introduced a bill on sandboxes. The rest of the states have done one thing or another, whether it's just introducing a bill or carrying something across the finish line. Out of Utah, we had an interesting universal sandbox application where I believe this came out of a university where they wanted to build basically an Uber app for towing, and it's called Tow Pro. In Utah's statute, it is illegal for payments, for web-based payments, to be involved with, calling a tow truck. And it was just something as simple as that. They applied to the sandbox, asked for a waiver of this statute so that they could create this app, basically. And through the trial process, they showed that this statute, this rule, was not protecting anyone. It wasn't advancing public health and safety. Rather, it was stifling innovation. And because they were able to display that, no one would get hurt when this was waived, the state legislature acted and amended it or repealed it completely, and Tow Pro was able to exit the sandbox and operate outside of it.
Okay, so they would have had to have gotten a bunch of permits and whatnot to enter the tow truck industry, and they were able to circumvent a lot of that. That's basically the gist of it.
Basically, they would have never been able to launch without the sandbox because their business model was illegal. Because Utah statute prohibited web-based payments to be used for a towing business, which is strange, if you ask me.
Well,
All right, well, go ahead.
Yeah, if I might hop in on that. Rees's story shows one of the real potential values of a regulatory sandbox, which is it allows for policymakers, be it in the legislature or at the regulatory level or wherever, to actually get data on whether or not a given rule or law is fit for purpose and necessary. And that can help people reform rules or reform laws, because instead of it just being a sort of fight over people's priors and assumptions, now we can have actual tests and people can look at the results and say, okay, well, look, in the case Rees mentioned, this law isn't forwarding health and safety. It isn't justified. We have data now on that fact. It isn't just a hypothetical. So we can feel comfortable removing it. In the alternative, and I am not aware of a case like this, but it could certainly happen. What if, something like that happened, but it turns out the law actually is really valuable. It turns out that the law does in fact do a lot of good for public health and safety. Well, now we have data on that fact, and it isn't just a battle of who thinks what. We actually have concrete data. So that's one of the big values for policymakers and for sort of the political process of potential, or one of the potential values for a sandbox.
And I want to stress the importance of a universal sandbox. I often get questions, what are the most likely regulations or statutes to receive a waiver, or for folks to approach a sandbox and ask for that waiver? And I just kind of go, I don't know. Because in Utah, we've had applicants approach so that they could get a hot, cold tub plunge business approved. And then we've had folks approach us about blockchain or financial technologies overall. So when you open it up to all industries, sky is really the limit. And, something that I heard from Arizona Sandbox that I thought was really cool is that even if these companies come into the sandbox and their business model or their innovative offering fails, that's still a good thing, because the sandbox is working and these companies are realizing that, at least how they have it now, it wouldn't be a viable product on the full market. Whether they win or lose in the sandbox, I think it's all, part of that mission of advancing innovation.
Excellent. Well, Rees, haven't given you a real chance to do an overview here. And, we've, of course, been working on this concept here in New Mexico, really in the last few months. We weren't really involved in the legislation that got introduced, but it didn't go very far in the last session. But talk to us about where some of these concepts have been applied. And you mentioned a universal versus an industry specific. And if you could kind of briefly describe what that means as a universal versus looking at specific industries.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, 3 states have what we call a universal sandbox. That's Utah, Arizona, and Kentucky, with several others considering similar bills. And basically that says any and all industries are welcome to apply to this sandbox to request a temporary regulatory or statutory waiver. And even if an applicant maybe touches 3, 4, 5 industries, this is the type of sandbox that's best for them. Now, on the flip side, and where a lot of states have started, Arizona, Utah, Kentucky included, they start by targeting just one industry. In Arizona and Utah, we started with financial technologies, as to where Kentucky started by just saying, hey, let's have a sandbox for insurance. Now, that has started to grow, and I'm grateful for it, where states like Mississippi have introduced an energy sandbox or an agriculture sandbox. Connecticut implemented an energy technology sandbox to try and open the door for innovation and delivering efficient, affordable, green energy. And then on top of that, you get other, quantum computing has been introduced in Congress to target that new and emerging technology. So really, at the end of the day, you can apply a sandbox to any and all industries. Sky's the limit.
And then, so you said, what, 13 total states? So 3 have a universal sandbox, and you mentioned those, and then several others have looked at specific areas that they want to target, right?
So 14 states currently have active sandboxes. 15 if you count Nevada. They recently sunsetted their financial technologies or fintech sandbox. But then on top of that, there are only 14 states across the country that have yet to introduce a bill or even have any discussion at all. The rest of the states have either passed a bill or introduced it. So it definitely has some momentum across the country.
Excellent. Brian, anything to add to that before we move on briefly?
No, not really. I think that's a pretty good summary.
Yeah. So, in terms of these approaches to sandboxes, I guess the argument from some free market type folks would be, if so many of these regulations are trivial or are better off being waived in some circumstances, shouldn't the legislators just go in and eliminate some of these regulations for all businesses rather than just kind of creating this sandbox approach. Brian, I assume that's maybe up your wheelhouse, but if Rees wants to jump into, that's fine.
Well, it is in my wheelhouse. Yeah, so that would be what you're suggesting is sort of the first best solution. But politics are what they are, and this gets back to what the discussion we were having about that tow truck app, right? It's easier to convince a legislature to get rid of a law or a regulator to get rid of a rule if you have a concrete data and an experiment showing, look, this isn't necessary. It doesn't do, the law does not do what it's supposed to do, or technology or market innovation have sort of resolved the risk that the law was supposed to address in a better way. So one of the values of the sandbox is that like I said earlier, it can and should serve as a laboratory where that information can then be taken and used for legal and regulatory reform broadly. One critique of sandboxes, which I do think has some value, but I also think that the risk can be mitigated. And a former colleague of mine and I wrote a law review article about this, is the concern that, well, if a sandbox is valuable, if it gives market participants something, otherwise why would they participate? And you can't let everybody in, you only let some firms in, isn't the government in effect picking winners and losers? Because you have some firms that get this regulatory waiver and other firms do not. And there is concern about that. Like, that is a legitimate concern. I think that there are ways to mitigate that concern, like having, your presence in the sandbox be short term. I mean, not long enough that you can do a legitimate experiment, but not something that you just can persist in forever and ever. And as I see it, the general average in the United States is 1 to 2 years with a 1 year possible extension. You want to, and many states have adopted this policy of, if you have a competitor, if one of your competitors is in the sandbox, that should count as a point in favor of your admission, not a guaranteed admission, but a point in favor. And one really important thing is that any learning that comes out of that sandbox, particularly sort of the application of law or regulation to a new technology or a new product or a new service, that should be socialized as best as possible. Not the proprietary information of the firm, but the legal or regulatory insights. And of course, as happens here, to take that Utah example, they changed the law for everybody. And actually, I was on an event with a fellow from the Utah Sandbox recently, and he mentioned that at least one state agency is using a competitor of that app. So not only did that app benefit from this, but it also opened up the door for competition, where now a new firm is able to enter that market and compete, even though they were not the ones in the sandbox.
Interesting. Okay.
And do you mind if I add really quick to that?
Yeah.
A problem I frequently hear from legislators is they want to do regulatory reform, but then they sit down, and of course there are those obvious, like, duh, this shouldn't be on the books anymore, regulations that they can go after. But then there are these some more obscure regulations that they don't learn about until they invite the business community to the table to highlight, the less obvious regulations getting in the way of innovation. TowPro being one of those out of Utah. And on top of that, the sandbox has a bit of an unsung hero across all the states that possess them, is these startup companies, these newer guys that don't have the money to hire a high caliber lobbyist or attorney to figure it out for them. They'll approach the sandbox, and through those discussions, learn that they can operate without the sandbox, which is much cheaper than hiring an attorney or a lobbyist. And on top of that, as you mentioned, kind of the potential problems with other companies not getting the same waivers, that's something we tried to address in Utah's Universal Sandbox. Our director, his name's Dane Ishihara, we put his office in the governor's Office of Economic Development, and he has the final say on applicants. And in his job description, in the bill language, it's written to where he serves as a liaison between the companies, the regulators, and the legislature, but also the competing companies out there on the market that are already existing. So for example, if a new and innovative insurance company applies to the Sandbox, gets accepted, it's his duty to then go out to some other insurance companies and say, hey, you have a foot in the door to receive the same waiver of this same regulation, to try and, maintain that fairness and open that opportunity to everyone, not just that one or two, not just those one or two companies in the Sandbox.
Interesting. Now, this is a relatively new concept. I don't know, when did the first Sandbox come into being? Anyone got that information off the top of their head?
So I believe it was the UK's FCA Sandbox in 2016.
How about at the state level in the United States?
So Arizona was the first state. I think it was 2017 or 2018.
So that's, we're getting towards 6 years. Is there any data, or has anyone done a analysis highlighting kind of how these regulatory sandboxes spur innovation in their respective states, and maybe comparing them with others? Obviously there's a lot of research about regulations out there, and you generally find that less regulatory places tend to grow faster economically. Is this something that can move the needle on overall economic development?
So I am not aware of any study done specifically in the United States. As I mentioned earlier, sandboxes are also an international phenomenon, and there is some evidence that from the international space that sandboxes can help increase business investment, can help increase economic growth in the jurisdictions that have them through a couple of mechanisms. One being lowering the information asymmetry, right? Because in going through the sandbox, a firm becomes more transparent, and that gives investors some comfort. A less desirable possibility is that the going through the sandbox serves as a stamp of approval by the government, and that gives the firm something of a halo. I will say, in the United States, one of the things that sort of permeates American sandboxes is that there's an explicit disclaimer of any sort of endorsement on the part of the state. And so that's there to help mitigate against that risk. And then I do know, and this is a little bit of a different beast, so we want to be careful about drawing too many parallels, but in Utah, their Supreme Court has also had a sandbox for legal services. And they put out a report a couple of years ago and found that, and to be clear, this is not that they're allowing non-lawyers to practice law, but it's things like allowing non-lawyers to own a law firm, or relaxing who can provide ancillary services sort of around the margins of the legal profession. And as I recall, the findings were pretty solid, that it did contribute to innovation and to competition without much in the way of negative impact on the quality of the services provided.
There are a handful of states that allow non-lawyers to practice, I think. Not many, but a handful, right?
I'm not aware of any. I do know that, like my home state of Virginia, you don't necessarily have to have a law degree to become a lawyer. You can read the law and then take the bar. I'm not aware of any state that allows a non-lawyer to practice law except on their own behalf, which everyone can do, but probably generally not a good idea.
Fair enough. All right. So what types of sandboxes are there? Obviously, a universal is pretty self-explanatory, but there are a wide variety of these kinds of things. And I've even seen some, apparently AI is an area where there's some sandbox activity. I'm not sure how that all works, because to my knowledge, there's not a great deal of regulation currently on AI, but where are the areas of our economy that are most likely to see this kind of sandbox concept being developed?
Well, so as I mentioned earlier, I think that they work best. Well, let me back up. The reason why I think sandboxes started in the financial services space is because financial services are both preemptively regulated. You need to go get permission to even offer the service, and they're highly regulated. I mean, financial regulation is very significant. And so that's
So what kind of financial services are we talking about? Like, I mean, banking is extremely heavily regulated. I can't imagine that being done through a sandbox model. What are some of the types of financial services that might be made available under the sandbox regime that we don't see without it or have to be regulated?
Well, so one good example would be money transmission, which is something you don't have to be a bank to do, but if you're not a bank, you generally have to be a state licensed money transmitter. And you have to get your license before you can do anything. And that is an area where there has been a lot of their efforts at innovation, partially, though not exclusively, through things like distributed ledgers. And so that was an area that I think was a good candidate. It is a good candidate for the sandbox treatment, because if you have a new way to move money, you're not entirely certain it works. You want to test it out before you go get the have to go get the license. And we haven't really fleshed this out, but generally, as part of being admitted to a sandbox, you have to have a plan for making your customers whole if something goes wrong, and the means to affect that plan, right? So that would be a good example of, I think, an industry that is well suited to the sandbox treatment.
So like Venmo, to name one example.
Yeah, I mean, Venmo has all of its money transmission licenses already, but if they wanted to go to try something else where they needed some new license, or where, you can imagine a scenario where they look at they want to open up a new line of business. They're not entirely certain it qualifies. They're not entirely certain it will work, and they're not entirely certain it qualifies as money transmission. That might be a good one for them to go to a state and say, well, we want to try this out. We don't think it's money transmission, but we really kind of need to see. We understand that you need to see. That might be an example. But certainly if you're trying to create the next Venmo, something like a sandbox could be very valuable.
And I think another one.
Real quick though, I have one more question for Rees before I come back to you.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about a state with a sandbox model on money transfer, a lot of those transfers tend to be from one state to another, or at least people who are residents of one state to another. I'm not familiar enough with the regulatory environment to know how the sandbox would affect that. Is that just kind of, if you're in Utah and you develop one of these money transfer systems, then you can do that in Utah under the regulatory sandbox model? It doesn't matter what New Mexico chooses to do or doesn't do?
Well, so at least initially, the requirements tend to be that the firm needed to be in the state and the customers needed to be in the state. And that way, it was an intrastate transaction. And so only Utah law would apply. If I'm in Utah and I'm offering my services into New Mexico, I need to comply with New Mexico law, or else I will be in trouble. Now, what we have seen is that some states have built-in reciprocity agreements into their sandbox, so that Utah and Arizona could say, well, okay, if you let a firm into your sandbox, we will treat it as if it is in our sandbox. And so we can, that firm can use customers in Arizona. And where that can be valuable, of course, is if you are a state with if your state has a relatively small economy compared to the heavyweights, right? California, Texas, Florida, New York. And, this is an opportunity for you to get firms, homegrown firms, to experiment with things, but be able to offer them a larger potential group of customers so that they can effectively experiment.
Okay. My apologies, Rees. Go ahead.
No worries. I just wanted to provide an example of a fintech sandbox participant to maybe give a better idea. West Virginia's one and only sandbox participant. They relocated, I believe, from Pennsylvania to West Virginia to take advantage of the sandbox. And they built a platform where financial advisors can advise their clients on investment into cryptocurrency. So that's just another example that it can, outside of money transmission, it can also apply to cryptocurrency. That's why Hawaii sandbox is so successful, because outside of the sandbox, cryptocurrency is illegal and it's only legal in the sandbox. So overregulated industries tend to thrive with a sandbox, or the innovation, I should say.
So crypto, hold on, you said cryptocurrency is illegal in Hawaii, or what can you clarify that?
Yeah, in essence, it's illegal. If I'm remembering the particulars correctly, for every dollar in cryptocurrency, you need to have $1 in cash reserves outside of the sandbox, which is just so difficult with the fluctuation of the values assigned to these cryptocurrencies. And so they set up a sandbox to try and, open the door for that to see what's going on. And inside the sandbox is the only area where dealing in cryptocurrency or business regarding cryptocurrency are legal.
Wow, that's wild, but I guess it kind of highlights some of the pluses and minuses, if you will, of the sandbox model, because you maybe not enable, but certainly the overregulation is quite prevalent there in Hawaii. And we know it's a state that tends to be a heavily regulated, high cost to do business kind of place. But you have the sandbox to mitigate that, but it also probably mitigates against legislative efforts to reform what is, by I think all estimates, a very heavy and unnecessarily so regulatory burden. So if I'm wrong with any of that, please feel free to correct me, though.
No, you hit the nail on the head.
All right, great. So here in New Mexico, we had a bill in 2023. So our 60-day session, which just was this year. We're moving towards the 30-day session, and the idea is, at least so far, to do something around what's called fintech. If somebody could define fintech, because that's not exactly a commonly used term, at least in New Mexico either. So before we move on, how about fintech defined?
So, all right. By one at its broadest, fintech is just the application of technology to the provision of financial services. So the ATM is fintech. Double entry bookkeeping is fintech. The abacus is fintech. As it has been used recently, it tends to mean like disruptive use of computer technology to provide services. Distributed ledger and crypto would be an example. The use of artificial intelligence and machine learning for underwriting would be an example. The use of like non-bank online-based lenders could be an example. Fintechs, when people say a firm is a fintech, what they tend to mean, though there are always exceptions, is we're talking about a non-bank, relatively new firm that is offering, or at least purports to offer, a new, innovative, or disruptive way to do a financial transaction. It's not that there are new financial transactions necessarily. I mean, the types of financial transactions are relatively fixed, certainly on the consumer side, but it's different ways to do it that are hopefully better, cheaper, faster, easier, more secure, or whatever.
All right, well, that's great. And the bill, so folks can check it out if they want to, was HB 356, in, again, the 2023 session, introduced by a group of Democrats, Meredith Dixon, Linda Serrato, Jerry Ortiz-Pino, state senator, as well as Mo Maestas, another state senator. So a pretty diverse group there of Democrats. I think Dixon and Maestas would be moderates within the current Democratic Party. Serrato and Ortiz-Pino generally more to the left, which brings me to kind of the next point of discussion is, where do you guys see things moving in states like New Mexico, especially a blue state? Now, I'll add that it's always a challenge with the 30-day session, the governor controlling the agenda, and the 30-day being a very, very tight window in the legislature. That those are challenges for getting things done in this 2024 session. But is this a concept, Arizona, pretty red state, Utah, pretty red state, but it doesn't seem like this is a total partisan issue either. So let's talk about the politics of this situation.
Yeah, this is a policy that in my work and Libertas' work, we've had a lot of luck getting Republicans and Democrats on board. As I mentioned earlier, Hawaii has a sandbox. Connecticut has a sandbox. Even Vermont. Vermont was the second state to implement an insurance sandbox. And in Utah, we had bipartisan unanimous support when our universal sandbox moved through. New Mexico is an example I often give of a Democratic sponsor behind a sandbox. Nebraska is another one that comes to mind. Senator Anna Wishart, she introduced last year a universal sandbox. They compromised, and she came back earlier this year with an insurance sandbox and got it across the finish line. But this really seems to be a policy that can be messaged effectively to both sides of the aisle, whether it's helping the little guy and creating smart regulation around these new and emerging technologies, or, just embracing innovation and having smart deregulation with these real examples. We've had a lot of luck and success getting both sides of the aisle on board with this. Missouri's another state, Virginia, where when votes have been cast, it gets support from both sides. I'm hopeful for New Mexico, to say the least.
Wonderful. Brian, anything to add to that?
Well, I cannot handicap politics to save my life, but I will agree that I believe properly designed and properly executed, and like basketball, execution is everything. Sandboxes can offer benefits that should be recognized by people across the political spectrum. But it will come down to execution.
So what kind of groups, interest groups, if you will, tend to oppose these kinds of things? Is it just depending on whatever industry you're looking at, or are there kind of pro-regulation interests that just always stick their necks out and try to stop these kinds of sandbox proposals?
It's not really consistent in my experience. Sometimes the regulatory agency opposes it because they think they're in the best spot already. They don't need this sort of tool. A lot of it really comes down to education. Some folks will claim that the sky is going to fall. It's going to be the Wild West of deregulation, and that's just not the case. There are safety guards built into the sandbox from the second someone files an applicant to the exit out of the sandbox. And sometimes you get those industry incumbents that have been around 50, 60 plus years that helped create the regulations that they're now abiding by. And they often make the claim that, hey, this is just for the little guy. This isn't for the old, giant titans of the industry. And my response to them is the sandbox is open to any and all, old and new, big and small. And that's what the beauty of it is. So I really just think a lot of it comes down to education. The sky's not going to fall. This is open to everyone, and everyone can play in the sandbox. I didn't mean to cut you off, Brian.
That's fine. Any last words for us as we got to wrap this thing up? So any policy papers or anything you've written, or any areas that you would like to point people if they're interested in more information about the concept here?
Yeah, I mean, if your audience is interested in some really exciting reading, the Sandbox Paradox in the South Carolina University of South Carolina Law Review. I wrote that with my former colleague Trace Mitchell, and that would be one piece just to look at. But I think otherwise, Libertas has done a lot of great work on it.
Rees, where can people find information from Libertas?
Yeah, it can be found at our website, libertas.org. /outreach/sandbox. We have a whole webpage dedicated to tracking all of the introduced and implemented sandbox bills across the country, as well as a one-pager, some interviews, and a policy brief. And on top of that, I mean, if you have out-of-state listeners, like Nevada Policy next door just released a sandbox brief. Many other state-based think tanks have begun publishing their own. And you might be surprised what you find if you Google a state and Sandbox.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys both for your time. And I know we'll be talking as the session kicks off in January, and it'll be quick with 30 days in this legislative session, but we'll see what shakes loose in terms of the Sandbox concept. So thanks again, and thank you for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play a Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.